So before we get to Mobutu and house arrest and so on and so forth, which is this, all this is very true, that Mobutu first was getting some kind of subsidy from the United Nations, and then the Belgians and the Americans began to pay him directly. And so he was able to commandeer the loyalty of the troops because the Belgians and the Americans had given him so much money to pay, or I should say, some of the troops to overthrow Lumumba. But before this, yeah, let's get to before this. There was another attempt, yeah, to get rid of Lumumba, and that attempt was a political one, whereby Joseph Kasavubu, who was the president of the country at that time, had gone onto the radio and declared and effectively declared that Lumumba is no longer the prime minister, and that he's installing another prime minister called Ileo. I forget Ileo's first name. Yeah. What I want to read is from this book once again. Pan-Af Great Lives, Patrice Lumumba. Yeah, very good overview of this whole history about Kasavubu's attempted coup. Okay, so let's get to that, and then we'll get back to Mobutu shortly. All right, all on there. Okay, right, so let's get to that right now. Yeah, so we're reading from this book. As you can see here, oh, sorry, hold on there. Make sure the right thing's on the screen. Okay, as you can see here, the Kasavubu and Mobutu coups. We're not going to go into the Mobutu one directly right now. We're just dealing with the Kasavubu one. The orders went out that Lumumba should be eliminated. However, he should be eased out by constitutional means as far as possible. Since Kasavubu was the president, he was thus pushed onto the stage. The African delegates from the Leopoldville Conference had scarcely reported to their, by the way, one thing that we don't have time to go into today, but I would love to go into in a bit more detail, is that Leopoldville conference. That was an all-African conference at which Lumumba was trying to elicit the support of African nations to, among other things, form a military high command that will be under the governance of African nations. And this was because of the fact that the UN was at very best duplicitous, and at worst actually criminal in its allegiance with America and Belgium. He was exposed to him. That duplicity was exposed to him, and so he tried to at this conference to initiate the process by which Africa could develop its own military high command that would be able to adjudicate matters such as the crisis that he was experiencing at that moment in time. Unfortunately, the level of the colonial mentality among many of our leaders at that time did not allow for that to take place as a result of that conference. Yeah, that's cutting a long story very short, but another day we shall go into that and Lumumba's speech at that conference and what he was trying to initiate at that conference and why it didn't come to fruition. All right, but let's go back to this particular reading. Okay. The African delegates from the Leopoldville Conference had scarcely reported to their heads of states when Kasavubu announced that he had decided to dismiss Lumumba and to dissolve the parliament. In a radio broadcast on the 5th of September 1960, he said, "I have most important news to announce. The Prime Minister, who was named by the King of Belgium, has betrayed the mission assigned to him. He has been governing arbitrarily, and even now he is in the midst of throwing his country into a civil war. That is why I have decided to immediately dissolve Parliament." He declared that a new government under Joseph, there's a lot of Josephs in this story, Ileo, president of the Senate, was to be set up. Yeah, Ileo was allegiant to another one of the pro-Belgian political parties, and it should be also understood that Kasavubu didn't just go do this by himself. This was a suggestion by the American forces, and Larry Devlin was an aide and an advisor to Kasavubu in his action to dismiss Lumumba. Yeah, the problem was that Kasavubu wasn't astute enough to engage little things like locking off the radio. Yeah, locking off Lumumba's access to the radio station. After he announced this, he went home and went to sleep and didn't put in place all the other things that he's supposed to put in place under the advice of Larry Devlin. Okay, this outrageous statement could well have come from any Belgian minister, but it was the voice of Kasavubu who uttered these disgusting words. If there was one truly representative government that the Congo has had in its tragic history, it was the one that, headed by Lumumba. For the sake of national unity, he allowed past and bitter quarrels, because they had some differences before, even prior to independence, to be forgotten, and he included in his government all the parties which were represented in the parliament except Kalanji's breakaway group. That was Kalanji broke away from the MNC. Yeah, that was Lumumba's party. Even Konakat was represented. That's Konakat is Shombe's group. Yeah, in Katanga was also represented in the national government of the Congo, and that was Lumumba's attempt to bring all these people together and have a united government rather than a fractured government. Ileo came from Kasai, and thus this province had representation. Even if the Kalanji's supporters were not in, the Kalanji is also from Kasai, and he was the one who led the Kasai cessation attempt. How then could Kasavubu call this arbitrary rule? Further, the civil war was brought in by Belgian aggression, and Kasavubu knew very well how he, as president, was not allowed to land in Katanga. One of the things that happened, when Katanga tried to secede and Shombe announced this, Lumumba and Kasavubu tried to go and visit Shombe in Katanga, in Elizabethville, the capital of Katanga. And what happened is the Belgian troops stopped Lumumba from being able to land and visit Shombe, and Kasavubu was on the plane, and an army officer came on the phone to let Kasavubu know that he would be allowed to come and see Shombe, but Lumumba would not be allowed to do so. Yeah, all right. Lumumba was traveling the whole country with Kasavubu during this period to try and solve some of the problems and settle some of the differences between different groups of people at this time. Okay, but then this was the voice of the colonial masters coming out through Kasavubu. Lumumba replied with characteristic speed. I want people to understand the levels of the challenges that Lumumba is facing 2-3 months into his prime ministership. Yeah, and so how Lumumba fought back is the title of the show. So we're going to get into some of how Lumumba fought back. Kasavubu announces his that he is dismissing Lumumba from the government. What happens? Lumumba replied with characteristic speed and vigor. The very same evening, he said, the popular government will remain in power. I proclaim that as from today, Kasavubu, who has betrayed the nation by collaborating with the Belgians and the Flemish, is no longer the head of state. The prime minister was ready to do battle with his president, who had joined the traitors. He had to contend with two occupying powers. He was faced with the rebellions in Kasai, fomented by Fourminier and using Kalanji, as well as the cessationist moves in the Lower Congo, that's Shombe, funded by Union Minier. All right. The two occupying powers, by the way, are Belgium and the United Nations. But these were enemies who were open, and Lumumba welcomed this, for he knew who they were and how to fight them. However, it was the fifth column within his own government which worried him, for he did not see clearly who they were and could not gauge their strength. The crisis now forced them to come out into the open. One such hidden enemy was Justin Bomboko, his foreign minister, who had in fact chaired the Leopoldville Pan-African Conference. So Justin Bomboko is another. There are so many traitors in this particular story. And from a Jamaican perspective, we might argue that Justin Bomboko has one too many syllables in his surname. But that's another subject for another time. Kasavubu, to put the stamp of legality on his coup, had obtained the signatures of 2 cabinet ministers. One of them was Bomboko. Kasavubu, in his haste, had made a tactical blunder. Yeah, he had bypassed Parliament. So, in order for him to do what he did, he would have to get the agreement of the Parliament of the Congo. He did not do so. Both the Chamber and the Senate, the highest organs of the state, which were elected by the people. In a counterattack, therefore, Lumumba called both houses together on the 7th of September in the Chamber. 90 out of 130 members were present. Only the openly fascist members of Konakat and the Kalangis stayed away. That's the parties in South Kasai and Katanga, who were trying to break away from the Congo. Kasavubu's own party was present. That's Abako. Thus, it had equal opportunity to present its views to the Parliament. Lumumba threw down the gauntlet and turned the assembly into a court to judge both of their actions. Yeah, this is the political astuteness of Lumumba. He didn't just he said what he said, and he dismissed he counter dismissed Kasavubu from the government, and then called the Parliament together to judge what not just what Kasavubu had done, but what both of them had done. Yes, now listen carefully. The tactics employed by Lumumba were brilliant. He spoke for 2 hours and he was deliberately conciliatory. Yeah, the man had just dismissed him from the government and was spreading all kind of propaganda about him. But he enters this meeting with the Parliament in a conciliatory matter. Kasavubu's supporters were put on the defensive. The Chamber passed a resolution declaring both the actions of Lumumba and Kasavubu invalid. The voting was 60 in favor and 19 against, and there were 2 abstentions. Lumumba voted with the majority. Lumumba thus won. So Lumumba voted that his own action, yes, was wrong and should be made invalid, placing himself in the position of being prime minister again, and also Kasavubu in the position of being president once again. Yes, Lumumba voted with the majority. Lumumba thus won the first round clearly without any doubt. In the second round, he faced the traitors, Bomboko and Ileo. Bomboko had to explain his treachery before the Senate. Lumumba went on the attack, this time in changing tack, and did not spare his punches, and hit not only at the rank betrayal of Kasavubu, but exposed mercilessly the role of the 2 occupying forces, the insidious role of the UN and the open enemies, the Belgian aggressors. Lumumba carried the house. The resolution went beyond his expectation. The Kasavubu coup was condemned by the Senate by 41 votes to 2, with 6 abstentions. When Kasavubu had dismissed Lumumba, the idea was to form a government with Ileo at the head. It was to be a broadly based government to include all except the extremists. But now, with the adverse vote by Parliament itself, this looked ridiculous and foolish. It was clear that they were being pushed onto the stage by outsiders. Lumumba did not rest on his laurels after this victory. he called a joint sitting of both the chamber and the Senate. The plotters were thoroughly discredited and were demoralized. The joint sitting gave Lumumba full powers to deal with the situation as it arose, although a parliamentary delegation was appointed to supervise these powers. Out of 116 members present, 88 gave him these powers. I want you to understand what's happening here. Let me read that again. Lumumba did not rest on his laurels. After this victory, he called a joint sitting of both the chamber and the Senate. The plotters were thoroughly discredited and were demoralized. The joint sitting gave Lumumba full powers to deal with the situation as it arose, although a parliamentary delegation was appointed to supervise these powers. In other words, they're dealing with an invasion. When a nation is invaded, generally speaking, what happens in most nations is that a state of emergency is declared, and therefore those who are in charge of the armed forces are given certain powers to deal with the threat as it stands at that time. And Lumumba was able to negotiate those powers with the government, yes, with his government at that time. Okay, so he won a small victory against an attempted coup plot at that moment in time. This is part of the way how Lumumba fought back in the political sense, in the parliamentary sense, brothers and sisters. Many people are not aware of these facts. This is why we want to highlight them as we celebrate the 100th birthday of Papa Patrice Lumumba. Let us continue. Out of 116 members present, 88 gave him these powers. So much then for puppet Kasavubu's assertion that Lumumba was governing arbitrarily. So he had basically won the support of the government to do what he was doing in terms of dealing with the present danger. When Kasavubu announced his coup, the Belgians in Leopoldville toasted the news with drinks. They urged Shombe to join hands with him. So the same people that were encouraging Shombe to break away from Congo were encouraging him to join with Kasavubu in the Congo in the absence of a Lumumba government. That situation would become even more obvious after Lumumba was assassinated. Another subject for another time. Belgian ministers in Brussels were delighted and promised him full support. The US officials were making no public comment. While making no public comment, said privately, quote, "It is about time," unquote. Within a week, Lumumba had broken this network of conspiracy and had seized the initiative once again. Lumumba's victory was a blow to the US-dominated UN command, for in the crisis, it had openly sided with Kasavubu. A correspondent of Christian Science Monitor wrote, this is a US publication, wrote on the 7th of September 1960 that, quote, "What the UN is in fact doing, observers here say, is that it is helping to oust Patrice Lumumba from the premiership of the Congo," unquote. The reporter of Le Belge Rebri was equally forthright when he wrote, quote, "If Messrs. Kasavubu and Ileo finally win the victory they deserve, they will owe it to the United Nations." Once again, this is a Belgian publication now writing, "If Messrs. Kasavubu and Ileo finally win the victory they deserve, they will owe it to the United Nations." The United Nations is collaborating with the anti-Lumumba forces in, the United Nations is in fact not just collaborating, but Hammarskjöld, who was the UN Secretary General at the time, was in fact partly setting the agenda, yes, to oust Lumumba. Let's get that clear. Without UN authority, Lumumba would in a few hours regain control with the few hundreds of those loyal to him. So again, we see, that there are foreign powers and sellouts, puppet sellouts, among the people of the Congo, among the elite in the Congo, the government in the Congo, etc. But Lumumba was able to win out against them. And effectively, what happened is when their plan failed, their political parliamentary plan failed, they had to go back to the drawing board. America had to go back to the drawing board. Belgium went back to the drawing board, and the forces in the United Nations went back to the drawing board, all plotting for how to kill Lumumba. For how to get rid of Lumumba, and they decide that the only way to really get rid of Lumumba is to kill him. Brothers and sisters, there's more to get through. But I've been on for over 2 hours already. So I'm going to err on the side of prudence and pause here. And I will return with part 2 of how Lumumba fought back next week, Ojama Day, Wednesday, the 25th of June, brothers and sisters. That is what we're going to have to do. All right. So I hope ones and ones join me then. Yeah. Because there's more to get into in terms of how Lumumba fought back against being under house arrest. That where we got to in the documentary is when now Mobutu. So whereas Shombe, yes, they put Shombe on the chessboard. Shombe failed. So what they did was put Lumumba on the chessboard. And then brought Shombe back on the chessboard to support Lumumba. So we're going to deal with some of the victories that were won against the Lumumba onslaught next week. Sorry, the Mobutu onslaught next week, brothers and sisters. All right, so bear that in mind. Before I close, however, let me just take a couple questions. See if there's any comments in the chat that I need to respond to. If you have any comments, I'll stay on for another 5 minutes just to see if there are any comments or questions about what has been presented today. What has been presented today. So let me give some time for that to take place. But this history is entirely important, brothers and sisters. And what I wanted to do is bring to the forefront of our conversations the resolve of Lumumba, the intelligence of Lumumba, how Lumumba as a shrewd political actor, and how he was able to win these small victories against colonial interests in the Congo, but even less than a week, brothers and sisters, into the independence of the Congo. The challenges that this ancestor had to face in those 6 months are monumental. And in the narrative around the assassination of Papa Patrice Lumumba, we often don't fully appreciate the levels of the attack that this man was facing for a sustained period of time as the Prime Minister of the Congo. It's easy to take for granted and to not fully appreciate the extent that these devils went to ensure that this man was never able to govern. 10 days into his premiership, the Belgians invade the country and fund the cessation. So one of the reasons why I always say that even when I disagree with my ancestors, my revolutionary ancestors, ideologically on a policy or an action that they may have engaged in, very slow to critique. Because I think ten out of 10 of us faced with that kind of pressure would be found wanting in accordance with the metric of perfection. Me no know how them did do it, brothers and sisters. Me I tell you no. Yeah. And I've been walking with the spirit of Papa Patrice Lumumba for the majority of this year, reading and studying and rereading and restudying and Rewatching things that I've watched long time and all kind of different things. And one of the things that stood out to me was that this man was not just developing in terms of his revolutionary political consciousness fast, but his adaptability to meet the challenges that he was being faced with is an aspect of his character that I think is probably underappreciated. Hence, how Lumumba fought back, part one.